information only item. So we will be moving on to item 10.3, the May revised budget update and district's fiscal recovery plan, which will be presented this evening by Rose Ramos and Leilani.
Yes. Good evening again. Okay, so we have the May revised to the governor's proposed state budget for you. And the agenda for this evening is, if you could advance to the next slide, please. Leilani will be presenting first to give an overview of the May revise, the impact on the state budget and what it means specifically to K-12s. And then I will follow up with the impact on the district, cash, and our fiscal recovery plan. And we do have Vincent Harris, who will be sharing in the presentation with me. And then we will have some remarks by Tammy Sanchez, the CBO for SCOE. And so with that, I will turn it over to Leilani.
Thank you, Rose, and good evening, board members and superintendent. Thank you again for the opportunity to present to the board today. So just as a caveat, I'm going to be throwing a lot of information at you. I know that Rose already teased a lot of the information in the third interim report, and there's going to be a lot of information on these slides, but I know with the late hour, I will just be powering through, and there's probably more information than you need on the slides, but I'll just be highlighting some of the major points on the slides, and then happy to answer any questions at the end, since I'll just try to power through here as much as possible. So here, just summarizing information that we already covered at our last board meeting. We already had this information from a preview that the governor had provided before the release of the May revision on May 14. And so just as a reminder, what we're dealing with here, significant losses in revenue, about more than $41 billion, over 1920 and 2021 that are projected as part of the May revision. And then when you factor in the anticipated increase in the need to access safety net services, the governor is building in a $54 billion shortfall in his May revision. Next slide, please. So here, this is what the impact is of that shortfall on Proposition 98, which, as we know, is the state funding level that goes towards K-14 education. So here we see what the big difference is and the sharp decline between what the governor proposed in January for the 3 different years involved in the budget, the differences between the January numbers and then the May revision numbers, with that sharp decline in 2021. What this is translating to is that for LCFF, specifically for the local control funding formula, which is the core of our district's general fund budget, it's going to be a decrease of $6.5 billion that's proposed in the May revision. There was a slight uptick in the statutory COLA between January and May, but as noted here on the slide, that COLA is suspended for 2021. Next slide, please. So here's one of those slides with a lot of information for you. The main reason I included this slide in this presentation is to demonstrate that while it is a 10% reduction that's being applied to the local control funding formula, the practical impact of this 10% reduction is a net negative 7.92 COLA, is how we're explaining it. Because what's happening is first the governor is taking the 1920 base grant for the LCFF. You apply the 2.31% COLA because that's what we would otherwise get if it wasn't for the economic situation we have. And then the 10% reduction is applied. So when you compare the 1920 base grant that we received for LCFF and you compare that to what is going to be provided in 2021, the difference is a negative 7.92%. And then just as a reminder, it's not captured on this slide because this is only listing for you the base grants that we receive for the different grade spans. This cut will also carry through because supplemental and concentration grant levels that we receive as part of the LCFF are based on the base grants. So just so you know that cut does carry through to our supplemental and concentration grant funds that we receive. And then the other thing that's important to note is many of the cuts that the governor has proposed in the May revision will be triggered off if we receive additional funding from the federal government. And this would be additional funding that we would receive on top of the CARES Act, which we'll be talking about here in a few slides. The CARES Act has already been implemented, but as we know, Governor Newsom, our board just adopted a resolution calling for additional federal funding to help mitigate the impacts of the shortfall in revenues that we're experiencing. Next slide, please. As Rose already mentioned, one of the tools that the governor is proposing to help soften the blow a little bit for the cuts that we're experiencing within K-12 education is to do deferrals. So this just reiterates what Rose already mentioned at third interim, but specifically there is a proposal to defer $1.9 billion at the state level that would otherwise be going to schools in June. Instead, we'll get that a couple of weeks later in July 2020. And then there also is another proposal to defer funds in April, May, and June of 21 to sometime in the following fiscal year. And as Rose already mentioned at third interim, this definitely will have significant cash flow implications for Sac City, and Rose is already on top of it. Next slide, please. So other cuts that the governor has proposed, he's proposing more than $350 million in cuts across various categorical programs. So those are listed out here. So just to clarify, the numbers presented here are the reductions that are proposed in each of these different categorical amounts. So this is not the total funding left over, it's the level of the cut that is being proposed. So these will impact Sac City in different ways depending on what kind of categorical programs you avail yourselves of. And it's different percentage reductions in each of these programs. So for example, one of these is maybe about 10-12% of a cut, like the Adult Ed Block Grant, I believe that's about a 16% of a cut. But for CTIG, which I know Sac City does receive money from CTIG, that one is being reduced by more than 50%. So it'll be a smaller pot that school districts will be able to compete for funds if this proposal goes through. Next slide, please. And in addition, another cut that I thought would be worth noting is there is a cut that's proposed for childcare and preschool rates that the district receives. So these are, just another significant cut in our early childhood education programs. Next slide, please. All of that said, there were two bright spots that were part of the governor's May revision. One of them, again, Rose already built in, I believe, into her third interim projections. So if you focus on the bottom right part of the slide in the green, those are the new STRS and PERS employer rates that are proposed for 2021 and for 21-22. So that will be a big source of relief for school districts for the next 2 years. And it won't be costing the state any additional money because he's repurposing money that was already proposed to buy down the liability in the out years. So instead it will be used to pay down the employer rates in the next 2 years. Next slide, please. And then the second bright spot, which again, Rose already built into third interim projections, I believe, is that the base rate for special education, he did keep that proposal from January, which is something that will greatly benefit Sac City Unified. So we were very glad to see that he maintained this proposal to increase the base rate for special education. So currently we're at roughly 557 per ADA. So now the base rate, if this proposal goes through, will increase to 645 per ADA. So that's a significant increase for those school districts that are still funded at the state minimum target. Next slide, please. Okay, we've spent some time already talking about funds that the district will expect to receive under the CARES Act. So on the right side of the slide, the $1.65 billion that we'll be receiving in ESSER money, that's something that Sac City can be assured of receiving. We'll be receiving 90% of that total at the statewide level will be distributed to LEAs. And as we've mentioned before, Sac City will be receiving about $16 million in these one-time funds with a very wide use for us. And then a second pot of money that we've briefly mentioned in the past is $355 million that the state will be receiving in total in the GEAR fund. And that's money that the state can choose to allocate. Next slide, please. And the way the governor has proposed to allocate that $355 million is to throw it into this pot. The total will be $4.4 billion, and it's being proposed to mitigate learning loss. I believe Board Member Garcia mentioned earlier when we were talking about COVID relief and what the district is doing, lots of lawmakers, lots of policymakers have raised concerns about the impact the students dealing with learning loss because of school closures and the reliance on distance learning through this time. And so that's demonstrated here by the governor's proposal to allocate $4.4 billion in CARES Act, CARES Act money that the state is receiving. So this proposal has garnered a lot of attention. He has proposed to allocate this $4.4 billion and really target it at what he believes are the most vulnerable students that are being impacted right now through distance learning and through school closures. $1.5 billion of these funds would be distributed to LEAs based on the students with disabilities that they serve. No estimates have been provided by CDE or by the Department of Finance, but School Services does estimate that this will translate to roughly $1,900 per student. And then the remaining funds, about $2.855 billion, those funds will only go to concentration grant districts. So Sac City will be one of those eligible districts. And then it will go to all students in those concentration grant districts. Again, we do not have any official estimates from CDE or from the Department of Finance, but School Services is estimating that this would be about $735 per student if this money goes through. So there are strings attached, however. If this proposal goes forward, all funds would need to be expended by December 30, 2020, so before the end of this school year. And there are strings attached because the governor would like to see the money focused on 4 different categories to make sure that the funds are being used to help mitigate learning loss. So some of those things are extending the instructional school year, additional academic services such as providing devices like the district has been doing, additional learning supports, things like that. And the other thing that I would like to highlight though with this proposal is it is one that's garnered a lot of attention, and we anticipate that it will change significantly between now and when the budget is enacted, just because a lot of other stakeholders and a lot of lawmakers specifically do have other alternatives for how they would like to see the money go out, or perhaps allocating the money towards different things as well. So this is one we expect will change quite a bit before the budget is enacted. Next slide, please. And then the last thing is that the May revision did include a number of tools to help LEAs absorb the reductions that are planned. So these are various tools that would definitely help Rose and her team in balancing the budget and absorbing the reductions that are going to be anticipated through this the budget that's going to be enacted next month. So some of those tools, for example, are excluding the on behalf of employer payments that go towards PERS and STIRS, being able to exclude that from the RMA calculation. So that will help generate some savings for the district. And then another example is the ability to increase interfund borrowing limits. So that's another thing that would be helpful. Next slide, please. That said, there are a lot of flexibilities that we are still waiting for and would be very beneficial for Sac City in 2021. So there's going to be a lot of advocacy for this. This is something that Sac City has already formally asked for as well through various advocacy letters. One of those things, for example, is to have the same ADA hold harmless in 2021 that was granted to all LEAs in 1920 because of COVID. And another flexibility that would be greatly beneficial is flexibility in instructional day and instructional minutes requirements. Because, for example, if we have to employ some sort of creative solution for scheduling next year, or some sort of blended learning that includes a mix of distance learning, those flexibilities in minutes and days would be very beneficial for our district and others around the state. So it's a long road ahead between now and June, just as a reminder. And at this point, I'll turn it back to Rose, and she can walk through what the impacts are for Sac City specifically.
Certainly. Okay, so what we've done is you've seen some calculations that we put out last month. I think it seems like we're coming before you quite often with the budget. lots of information to share. And we had 3 scenarios that were recommended by FCMAT because the districts we didn't have all the information in terms of the budget, what to plan for. As we started learning more and more about the impact of the COVID-19 on the economy overall. So we prepared the 0% COLA scenario, the -5%, and the -10%. We know that that is going to be most likely a -10%, with that being an effective COLA of -7.92%. But because we did not include in third interim many of those other details that could improve the district's budget in third interim, we felt that a -5% was probably a good, better estimate at this point, not knowing yet where the state budget is actually going to land. And the items that we did not exclude that would help the district would be the STRS and PERS relief, which for us are proposed to be about $6 million and $5.6 million in the second year in terms of savings. And the other thing that's missing from this as well is the actual balances after our books are closed. We talked about that a little bit at third interim, that we still have 2 months of expenses and revenue that we're projecting. We don't know exactly where those are going to land. So there's an opportunity there to possibly recoup some one-time savings. And then Leilani spent quite a bit of time on the additional federal relief that we might be able to see. So all of these little details will add up and make a difference in reducing a little bit of that negative COLA. And then we're also assuming that the CARES funds at this point are restricted and they have to be spent by December of this year. And we're not sure if that is certain. So the next slide, if you could go there. There. And so now what we've done here is we've said, okay, so assuming that it lands closer to about a -5% COLA, this is what our situation would look like. We would have next year, we would have a deficit about $57 million, and in the third year, about $81 million. Our ending balance in that third year is a -$75 million. These are terrible numbers, of course. And it is $75 million negative because we are starting 21-22 projecting with a beginning balance of $6.7 million. So obviously we have no ability to make our reserve. I'm not even going to go look at the -10% because we know it's not going to be a gross -10% COLA. So I'm not going to spend too much time there. But it's there just in case you wanted to see that. So assuming that we do have a -5% COLA, what does that mean for the district in terms of our multi-year projections? It means that any balances below the 2%, our budget will be disapproved because we will not have the ability to meet our minimum reserve, which is about $11.5 million. And it will result in serious cash flows for the district. We did see what the impact would be with a 0% COLA. Now, with this effective COLA, it's going to be obviously far worse. So this next slide, we will show you the COLA at assuming a -5%, what it means per year. So the dark blue is the current year. We're fine. The green is the second year, and the red is the third year. And I really don't need to go into detail. You can see that by the time we get to the spring of next year, the district starts to have those serious cash challenges, and we basically run out of cash without a solution. And so the next slide shows the -10%, which is worse, right? This one accelerates it to this year, the fall of this year, about November-ish. We have one good month, which is January when tax receipts come in. And then after that, we fall into a negative situation and we stay negative and we do not recover. So this is very serious, obviously. And so what actions have we taken to reduce the budget since 18-19? We knew we were already headed towards, an unimproved budget and a serious deficit prior to COVID-19. And so about 2 years ago, the district did start implementing some serious reductions in excess of $30 million. And I showed you a slide in third interim that showed the one-time, the ongoing by year. And other measures the district has taken is that we've maximized the use of restricted resources. When Jackie Canfield was here, she presented a presentation, I believe it was at the May 16th meeting of last year, and went into great detail of how they did maximize the use of restricted resources in moving over allowable costs for example, staff development, supplemental teachers, staff training, and did it very carefully because, of course, these are restricted resources and we have to make sure that we're using them, per the guidelines. And then also maximizing the admin portion, because with each restricted resource, you are allowed to charge a certain amount of admin expenses. For example, with Title I, it's about a 10%. So we have to monitor that very closely. So she pretty much went through the entire budget and applied the maximum amount. And so that's been pretty much tapped out. And there was some reductions in the central office personnel, quite a bit. The reductions in the certificated staffing, we made sure that we were staffing according to class sizes for the collective bargaining agreement. And there was reductions to student services, and the supplies and service levels were reduced to 2 years ago, 17-18 levels. And we also transferred some debt service that was being paid for out of unrestricted general fund to an allowable facility fund, our developer fees. And so these are all the strategic things that districts do when they are combing through their budget to make sure that they're maximizing resources and applying, their expenses appropriately as possible and being very efficient. So the next slide is what's currently on the table for the district. These are some of the proposals that the district has made to SCTA to achieve cost savings. The first includes, which is our biggest one, is our healthcare plan premium contribution. Proposing 100% for individual, 75% for a plus one, and 75% for family, tied to the lowest cost plan, which would be Kaiser. This would generate about $17 million in ongoing annual savings. If we applied that same contribution level to district-wide to all employees, we would generate almost $23 million. And then looking at the OPEB contribution for our certificated unit, if we increase that contribution to 2% above the current contribution, we generate about 3.3 annually. And then there were some smaller modifications to some benefits, like prorating benefits for part-time employees and really controlling some of our escalating costs that are tied to some of our hourly rates. That would generate about $600,000 for the district on an ongoing basis. And then our next slide, we're going through this exercise just like all districts throughout the state. I'm sure you're seeing in their budget presentations a menu of budget reductions that they're implementing. We've calculated the cost of one furlough day, or the savings of reducing one furlough day. It's about $1.7 million. A 1% salary reduction is about $3.3 million. Our state auditor that completed the audit recommended 2%. A 5% is about 16.5. 10% is $33 million. And we put those higher percentages here because we've been hearing that at the state level, there is a proposal to reduce state employees' salaries by 10%. So we said, okay, well, what would that mean for our district in terms of ongoing costs? That's a very steep reduction, we understand, for employees, especially those in the lower end of the salary schedules. But it would generate about $33 million in annual savings to the district. And then the next slide is just, again, recapping that there are a few additional non-negotiable budget items remaining in our budget. The previous few slides did show all the reductions the district has made. And so we're just repeating what's been said before, that this is the significant amount of savings that are ongoing will have to come from negotiable items. And then the board, of course, our board does have to consider the impact of any additional non-negotiable budget items in terms of what does that mean for departments, what does that mean for educational programs, because they will have an impact, especially since we're a very lean organization already. And then our next slide, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Harris, who is going to talk a little bit about our student programs.
So ultimately, this slide is just meant to give a sense of, as a system, we've struggled with how do we deal with the crisis at hand. And crisis is in multiple levels. One crisis is, of course, the ongoing pandemic. And subsequently, now we're in the middle of having to resolve some significant fiscal challenges. But we know the center of our system is student success. And so we came back and we've been wrestling with those core things that define our success. So the core value speaks to the fact that we know there's already longstanding inequities long before we face these challenges that are ahead of us. We look to the promise of the guiding principle as a way to say this is what we are looking to fulfill for all of our students. And then ultimately, as the board heard back as we closed our summer, our PELP team actually looked at resetting how we think about our investment decisions for the whole district in terms of grounding every budget and instructional decision in school site and district planning using the principles of continuous improvement with the belief that all children can learn. And so ultimately, as we've been wrestling with what are the next steps, we've been thinking through the program implications. And on the right, we believe those are examples of the things that actually allow us to interrupt the core value, that allows us to fulfill the guiding principle, and frankly, allow us to resolve the Pell problem of practice. And so as we think about the budget considerations going forward, we've looked with an eye to try and sustain and maintain the things on the right and other things, because we think they are mission critical for the district to meet the needs of our community and frankly, to meet the demands, the rightful demands of the CAC, the LCAP PAC, the DLAC, and other community partners who've demanded of us to get our students to grade level.
Thank you. Okay, next slide, please. So to sum everything up, when we last presented at second interim, we were just looking at a roughly $27 million solution that we needed to achieve. And we know now that that has more than doubled due to this economic crisis and how that has been, passed off or shared. Now it will have to be shared by K-12 districts. And so now we're looking at, $57 million deficit next year, possibly $81 million in the third year. I mean, they're pretty significant. But we still have to continue looking for ways to balance our budget. We've already, as we shared, taken a bulk of reductions in non-negotiable items. And so there's very little for us to look for, but nonetheless, we continue to look for things like, as listed in this slide, requiring that our charter schools have balanced budgets so that the district is not making a contribution from the unrestricted general fund. And again, reducing supplies and contracts to the extent possible. At some point, we have to supply our departments and our operations with things like fuel and tires. They're necessities. They're not necessarily optional items. And so we need to balance those programs also that currently require a contribution from unrestricted funds. And so we are looking at all of these very seriously, but they do come at great cost to some of the programs and services. And yet we still need to resolve this fiscal issue that we're in. And with that, I am going to turn it over now to our Chief Business Officer for SCOE, Tammy Sanchez.
Thank you, Rose. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So because of the changing environment, we felt that it was time to come back to the board and discuss the issue of the emergency loan. Before I get into that, though, I did want to go on a little bit more and give you even some more comments on to the comments Rose already made, answering your question about the changes that happened from second to third interim. And so the first thing I wanted to say on that is that when you look at the education code, and the education code requires an adopted budget and first, second, and third interims, the reason they have that in the education code is because the people that wrote those laws recognized the changing environment that schools are in. And if we knew every dollar's in and out before the year started, we wouldn't need to have those other interim budget reports. The reason it's there is because it's necessary, and they expect it to be changing. If it weren't changing, we wouldn't need them. And when you look at where the revenue sources come for schools, that it's local, state, and federal governments, and we wish that they would tell us in advance all of the money we were going to get before the year started, but we're just not that lucky. They don't tell us everything. And this year, for instance, we didn't know there was going to be a pandemic. So we didn't know all of this federal relief was going to come and so forth. So there's just those things you don't know about before the year starts, which is the reason we have all of the different interim reports throughout the year and all the opportunities to talk about the changes. When you look at your thousands of employees, if all of them stayed and worked their full year and nobody left for sick leave or to take another job or to retire, and that didn't have any, and there weren't any vacancies or anything, then sure, we would know what our expenditures were going to be. But we do expect there to be changes like that. And I have to say, considering the pandemic and considering how many expenditures had to change quickly, for instance, all trainings and travels were canceled. And there's no way that that could have been known before. And the way our service model worked, that had to change suddenly. And so, of course, we're going to have changes from second to interim to third interim. And we're going to continue to have those changes. But I have to say that Sac City's changes were very tight, and they weren't out of line at all. So, and knowing that, I am going to talk to you about the emergency loan, because with information that, based on what we have today, and with complete certainty, I can tell you this information will change. So, but we're working with what we have right now. So, first of all, the May revise had extremely high cuts, which we've discussed, and school districts are expected to work miracles and do more services than they've ever had to perform before, and yet the cuts are the largest I've ever seen. And so there does seem to be a disconnect between the services we need to provide and the amount of money we're getting to do that. So I do hope that in the summer, when we have a better idea of what the budget's going to look like, I hope that there is some reevaluation, and I hope that it doesn't look as bad as it does now. We can be hopeful. The other thing that came with May revise was that it brought the deferrals. And I know Rose talked about that in detail, but I need to even give it a little more detail to put it in the context of the timing of the emergency loan. So in 2021, part or all of your April, May, and June apportionments have been delayed, and you'll receive it in July of 21. So what does that mean to Sac City? Well, based on that 5% cut scenario, it moves your the date that you run out of cash into the 2021 year. And that's when you would need an emergency loan. So it's moved the date forward. If we look at cash based on what we know today, it's looking like April, which is less than a year from now, that you would run out of cash. Now, the thing that the board needs to think about and realize that they're not going to be like most of the other school districts in the state is that before there was a May revise and before there was a pandemic, the district already had a structural deficit that already existed. And that situation is now worsened by the May revise cuts, and also the May revise deferrals. And so when you hear that other districts are going to implement cash flow borrowings to deal with the deferral, it might be something like a tax revenue anticipation note or some kind of borrowing like that. They have those opportunities to help them get through these deferral situations. That's not an option that will most likely be available to this district. And the reason it wouldn't be available is that the county superintendent, as part of his job, he has to look at the debt that school districts who don't have approved budgets or who don't have positive budgets, he has to look at any debt that they want to get and make sure they can pay it off. And if they can't pay it off, he has to make sure that that debt does not ever occur. So when you look at the scenario that's before you tonight, the deferrals are April, May, and June. And by the time that money gets here in July, you would have already had negative cash anyway. So there's no money in July to pay that loan off. So therefore, the county superintendent would not be able to sign off on such a loan. So it really does push your cash situation up before the deferrals. And so we're looking at April right now is what we're looking for. So what are the steps? Well, currently, FCMAT, they just recently have been called, and they're starting to work with your district, and they're coming in to confirm your budget numbers. They're looking at the district's budgets, cash flows, and your multi-year projections. Legislation will have to be written and to get the emergency loan, and that you have to allow about 6 months for that to go through the process. And then you also have to back up the 6 months based on, are the legislators in session and so forth. So we really have to start the process before that 6 months. So the county superintendent has already discussed this issue with Senator Pan to write the legislation. And right now, it's looking like we are about 10 months out from needing that emergency loan. And so we are working towards that right now, and that we are starting that process. Do you have any questions?
We can't hear you, President Ryan.
I know what's going on. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Tammy, I mean, we can take questions and then go to public comment and additional board member questions. I will just say, you know, this is incredibly sobering and frankly very depressing. What you're talking about in terms of the process for a state loan, which essentially will push us into state receivership, is troubling to say the least. I would like to ask, I mean, you were saying this is potentially 10 months out. You were speaking of this as if it's a done deal. Are there steps that the district can take to ensure that we are not forced into the situation of triggering a state loan and state receivership?
Yes, it is not too late. The district can still make cuts in time to put off or maybe completely eliminate the need for a state loan, and then hopefully there would be some more federal money or something like that would help come in and fill in any gaps that there might be. But it certainly what you get from the federal government isn't going to be enough to solve this problem. It might push it out a few months, but it's not going to solve the problem. So you really do need to be able to make the cuts. Certainly start with the 27 million you know about, and then add on the amounts that you'll get next month when you get your adopted budget. You'll have a new number to shoot for with the cuts from the May revise.
And Tammy, given the truncated timeline that we are now working with as a result of these very, I would say, challenging May revised numbers that are before us, and the fact that we have very little room, as was just articulated by Rose, in the $30 million of reductions and saving adjustments that were already made, the bulk of our cuts, as documented by the state auditor and others, seem to have to come from negotiated savings. So my question to you is, what is our timeline to be able to arrive at the negotiated savings necessary to prevent us from being pushed over the fiscal cliff?
So you have enough time till you run out of cash. The state administrator doesn't, or actually it's a county administrator now, but the administrator doesn't get assigned until the loan is funded. So you have a short period of time to make these cuts and get them implemented in time to avoid this. But once the loan is funded, all bets are off. So you have up to the time you get the loan.
Thank you. Are there other board member questions on this item before we go to public comment and return to questions on the full presentation? Board Member Garcia.
So I had a question about the tools that are available for school districts, including the exemption from deferrals for hardship reasons. So I'm wondering why this would not be a tool that Sac City Unified would use in order to get those the payments on time, as opposed to being a district that would be deferred, because it's obvious that I would think it would qualify under hardship. So is that something that the district could use?
So, and I'm going through my papers right now, and maybe Leilani can, but was the flexibility for this year or next year? Remind me of that.
So that is a flexibility that's proposed at this point in trailer bill language. I did pull it up, and the flexibility that I see in the trailer bill language, it would be for 2021 fiscal year, that deferral. I don't see, and I can look through it more closely, but I don't see that flexibility available for 1920. So in addition to it still having to go through the budget process to make sure that flexibility is in place, and 1920 could be something added in between now and when the trailer bill is adopted. But as currently written, the criteria for determining what qualifies the school for the exemption from the deferral, that's also something that would need to be included or negotiated as part of the budget process.
So let's say that a scenario exists where you are able to use the flexibility and you're able to use it for the entire deferral. Then instead of April, the way the cash flow looks now, you would be July.
In terms of running out of money? So I guess I just didn't follow that.
Yes, in terms of running out of cash.
Okay, so then we would still be looking at running out of cash, going into receivership and getting an emergency loan next year, whether it's in April or whether it's in July, absent any reductions.
Yes.
Okay.
So we're going to wrap up the presentation, go to public comment, and then we'll return to board member questions on the full presentation. Was that the last slide?
This is the last slide here.
Yes.
Ramos, yeah.
Okay. Do we have any public comment on this item?
There is no public comment on this item.
Okay. So we will return to board member questions and comments. If you can please raise your hand and indicate if you have questions on the presentation. Okay. Looks like we don't have any board member, board member Garcia, board member Morawski.
Yeah, so going to slide 16, the 57 million in deficit. I don't see the slides up. So, Rose, I'm wondering if that number includes the STRS and PERS savings, projected savings, the 6 million and 5.6 million.
It does not. It does not, Member Garcia. It doesn't include I'm looking for the slide. It doesn't include the STRS and PERS. We didn't have the details on that yet. Mm-hmm. And it does not include also, well, this one is a little trickier to try to figure out or calculate, any potential additional federal relief. We just didn't have enough details to figure that out. We're hoping that something will come before we wrap up the budget, the proposed budget for the 2021. And then, and any other, any other relief that the state may decide to implement before our budget is brought to you in June. Before it's brought to you in June.
Okay, so I mean, I realize that there's still going to be a deficit. I mean, we're already starting with one but it could be as high as 57, but it could be less. Could be.
That's why we figured that the negative 5% was a good ballpark.
Okay. Okay, and then I'm wondering in the local relief measures slide, that's slide 13. I'm looking at the first four measures, and we already talked about the exemption from deferrals for hardship and how that is something that the district may not benefit from. I'm wondering if there are other opportunities, specifically in the interfund borrowing, if that's something that can also be, helpful. Perhaps not long term, but I mean on a short term basis.
Yeah, typically the way these work, and I'll let Tammy and Terry also chime in if there's something else on the table that I'm unaware of. But it's just like a short-term loan. You still have to pay it back. It's obviously it says borrowing, and it has to be paid back generally within the same fiscal year. So yeah, districts do this sometimes instead of issuing a TRAN because they save on the loan cost of a TRAN. But yeah, so I'm not sure how this would help the district. If anything, it would just like buy us time. But if we had like another source that maybe was going to materialize in 6 months, and we just needed a bridge to kind of get us there until some ongoing revenue or some ongoing reduction was going to kick in. But yeah, so I'm not sure. This sounds like it's going to increase the limits because there are limits. That's what this is going to do. Is that right, Lila? Okay.
Yeah, from 75 to 85%.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think just moving forward, it would be really helpful to understand sort of the net impact. So what's that target number, and understanding how much of it is ongoing. How much of that number that we have to focus on, we have to address with ongoing savings versus one time, because we are poised to get, quite a bit, but it's all one-time dollars. So that's not going to solve the problem. And I get that. And then also I'm interested in learning more about, before a budget comes to us, actual proposals in terms of reductions and what that looks like, because we have very little room to, or very few options for reductions beyond what we've already done, right? And we've already approved. So, and especially as they impact programs. And then I did see that some of the salary reductions, just having enough time to process that information prior to having to vote on it. So I don't know what that looks like between now and adopting a budget in June. And I get that the budget in June is going to be based on a guesstimate from state funds, or the state budget. They're going to come back and revise their budget sometime in August. So I'm mindful of that, but I at the very least want to have more information rather than less, and with plenty of time prior to voting on a budget.
Okay.
Member Morowski?
Thank you. This is a really hard presentation. We're in a very, very bad place here. The risk of insolvency is much closer than it was, very recently. We thought we had more time to work on our problems, and because the timeline has dragged on and we haven't found ongoing solutions, we're in a very bad place from a fiscal perspective. I guess I have a couple different questions. Have you, maybe this question is for Tammy or for Rose, have you seen trigger language like in district budgets or contracts that, if this thing happens, then these reductions are made, or if this thing happens, then these are restored? Or
Yes, I have, and I'm sure probably Tammy has. Some districts have what's called a fair share model, and with a trombone clause where, you share in surplus, and there's, the formulas can get as complicated as they can get. And then in those years where you have reductions, there's also a sharing of the reductions. Actually, one of our one district that has a really good model is Los Rios Community College. If you look in their Appendix A for all their collective bargaining agreements, they have an excellent model in there that speaks to the fair share and the trombone clause, which does that exactly, Member Borowski.
So it's sort of adjusts things on an kind of an automatic basis.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I guess another thing I would just point out, just since it's rolling around in my head, that the 2019-20 budget the deficit number is quite a bit lower because we already did make significant reductions. And without those reductions, we would have been in a much, much worse place. So I think we also need to, kind of remember where we've been, and to put that in perspective too. So given the timeline and the risk involved, unfortunately, this is something where if a negotiated solution's not forthcoming, that puts us in a very difficult place of having to make some very, I wouldn't even call them like tough decisions. I mean, they are tough decisions. They would be tough, but they'd be like catastrophic, like extremely destructive to children, to our district, to our community, to our families. Like, I mean, the cuts that we're talking about having to make to stave off state receivership in the situation we're in now, without any additional, federal revenue, or I don't see a lot of hope for additional state revenue forthcoming. And the $4.4 billion, that seems very unrealistic that we'd be able to spend it by December 2020. So I don't know, I don't know how to process all that. But I guess I would like to see what's the number, what's our target number, and it's going to be wrong because we don't really know, but what's our target number and what's the plan to get there? That's our fiduciary responsibility to our community. What's the target number? What do we need to close, and what's the plan? Not to, close our deficit in 1 year, because that's not realistic given the size of the deficit, but how do we get through, think about it as a 2-year plan, and, what kind of catastrophic things do we need to do to avoid insolvency? I mean, that's basically where we're at right now, given what we know. So, I guess this is more to Rose. What's the plan to provide that information of just, what target number are we working with? What are the cuts? How much do they add up to? What's actually realistic? I mean, some of the cuts, if we that were explored last year, ended up being things that were only funded with restricted funds. And I know there's some flexibility in there if you can do funds shifts or things like that. But I mean, that's where we're at. I think we need to be honest. We're staring off the cliff. So.
Yeah, we'll have a better number for you on the deficit actually as we develop the budget and we start to comb through all the May revised details and see which ones do apply to us, because it's important that we take the credits too. It's easy to apply the reductions, but we know that there's some credits in there that we need to make sure we include. And so that'll be coming to you soon. And as far as additional reductions are concerned, we prepared the typical list that you see in many school districts, right? They're all doing that right now. But there's just so much little room elsewhere. It's the bulk of it is pretty much in salaries and benefits. But we can certainly go through that exercise and trying to comb through anything else that may be there.
I know the bulk is in salaries and benefits, but that's not something that, unless we have a negotiated agreement or the ability to do that, that's not something that we can use to solve our deficit problem. So, right? If that's not forthcoming, then what's left? The 7% of 6% that's not salaries and benefits. What is that? What are the dollars associated with it, and can it actually be cut? Mm-hmm. I mean, I think those are the conversations that we need to be having, right? I mean, unless I'm misreading this, or what would you say, Tammy? I mean, to avoid insolvency.
I would say you're hitting the nail on the head, that those are the conversations you need to have. I think Rose will have that for you in June. She'll have the number and what you're seeing. I mean, look, Sac City has a much more difficult issue than other school districts. But what you're seeing the other school districts do is they're going to have to make horrible cuts. And the hardest part is we don't even know what school's going to look like when we open school in September. Yeah. So, which is why the districts that do have reserves will fare better because they have more time to plan. You don't have time to plan. And so you're going to have to go make cuts. And where are you going to cut? You still have to turn the lights on. You probably need more custodians than you ever needed before because of cleaning and stuff. So it's going to be a difficult time trying to find places to cut.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's why we need to know what our options are.
Board Member Minnick?
I guess my memory from last year when we had this conversation, and then 6 months ago and 3 months ago or whatever it was, is that we have essentially cut everything that we can that's not negotiable. So I think to Member Morawski's question is, what are the other options? I think the other option, other than those negotiable items, is receivership. That is the other option. Because what we heard from Superintendent Gordon a few months back was anything else that we cut is going to make it impossible for us to function as a district and do the work that we are responsible for doing. So it seems to me that there isn't a list of other things to cut. Those other things are the things that allow us to be a school district. So I think it's the negotiable stuff, or we get that loan from the state. I think those are the options. Is that fair to say, Rose, or am I being extra gloomy?
No, I think that is pretty fair. I mean, certainly there might be little pockets here and there, but nothing substantial enough to resolve a 27 million plus. I mean, now we're looking at 50 million plus deficit. We could probably scrape together. I'm going to just, a couple million here and there, but nothing that significant.
Okay, I didn't want to think. I like to think that that's not true, but that's how I've read this whole process, and I don't want us to, fool ourselves into thinking that we have some sort of control over things that we can still have, a say in when there just aren't. Those things don't exist.
Well, and I think the point is well taken, and Tammy has said this in the past, as has Superintendent Gordon, that because we have had a salary and benefit structure that eats up the lion's share of our budget, 91 cents on every dollar, much more than other districts in the region, our choices in a difficult recession are very different than district choices that have healthy reserves, that have had the ability to invest at a higher level in programs and enrichment. So their cuts, while painful, are just far less painful. And at the end of the day, we're talking about the trade-offs are such that we cut to the quick and we still don't come close to the target we need to meet to avoid receivership. And I think to Member Morawski's point, and this I think is very important, I think we have to have a clear target number. I think we have to have a set of scenarios. I think we should be using the state auditor's guide for those scenarios, because the state auditor said there are very few places to cut outside of these buckets that they identified in their model template that they shared with us. And how do we build out those scenarios so that we get to the number we will need that is now deeper than the number that they had analyzed for to be able to avoid receivership? I will say, last week was one of the darkest weeks that I've experienced in a very long time. And it was because I was grappling with the reality that we made $30 million of painful cuts and budget adjustments that allowed us to avoid going off the fiscal cliff. And we did that in a way that had the least amount of harm to our students. And we did that in a way that allowed us to tackle everything we could outside of negotiated savings. And now that work is almost for naught because we're starting back at square one with very few options. And, I think I said last year, and I felt this burden heavily, that with the $30 million of cuts and reductions, we essentially had a stay of execution, but we were still on death row. Well, now we're on death row and our number has been called. And so, how are we going to meet that head on? It is very frustrating to me that in the face of a global pandemic, there are still narratives that are floating around that we may be in a financial crisis. We may be was the word that was used tonight. I remember in 2017 when we were told that we were in the best fiscal position in Sac City Unified's history, despite the fact that audit after audit said otherwise. And so my question now is, what do we do that truly puts students at the center of our decision making? How do we have the courage to take action to avoid receivership, to avoid going over that fiscal cliff, and to not take the easy route out, which is cutting to the quick, the very few programs we have that actually provide that enrichment, that support, that continuity that is so desperately needed for the most vulnerable populations in our district. Board Member Pritchett, I saw your hand up.
Thank you, President Ryan. And I agree with Member Morawski. We do need to have that target number so we know where we stand. It's unfortunate that we are having this discussion, and it brings me back to 2013 when we were having similar discussions. Member Wu can probably remember as well. And it was unfortunate because we proposed to close 11 schools, and those little pockets that Rose is talking about are going to be direct cuts to our students. That's where we're headed.
Do we have any other board member questions?
President Ryan.
Oh, I'm sorry. I need to take a vote to extend the clock to 11:15.
I'll move to extend to 11:15.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. So it looks like we don't have any other board member comments or questions. We had a very good, Board Member Wu. Yeah.
I think at the same time, we have to start talking about what we're going to negotiate. We're going to negotiate with our bargaining partners. Healthcare cuts and things like that have to be on the table, and we have to face that.
Yeah, thank you, Board Member Wu. I try to be an optimist, but I will tell you that the gravity of the fiscal predicament that we are in weighs heavily on me, because at the end of the day, I know most of us on this board are parents with children in the district. And so we're going to feel the effect of our budget decisions for years to come. And frankly, when I think about this idea of a pandemic generation, a generation of students who are traumatized by this experience, who have learning loss, and then bear the brunt of painful cuts that we will be called to make in the coming weeks and months, it's overwhelming, to say the least. I do know that we can find a path forward, but the path forward has to rely upon a realistic target and a set of negotiated savings that will minimize the harm to our children. And that has to be our goal.
President Ryan.
Yes, Superintendent Aguilar.
Thank you. Just wanted to comment, particularly based on board member feedback. We, of course, will get right to preparing budget. I do want to commend the staff for all the work to prepare for the third interim report. But I too feel like we were here a year ago in which the board asked us to provide potential Plan Bs, if you remember, where we presented each of the programs that we could potentially cut with exact amounts of dollars that each program represented, where we were asked to conduct an analysis of what the impact could be potentially if we made cuts to, say, the GATE program, or we eliminated specialty programs, or we eliminated programs in which we were putting from our general funds to sustain those programs as well. In that regard, we're in the same exact place that we could probably just take out our notes again and say, here's what we think would happen if we eliminated our specialty programs, which cost this much money, if we eliminated our athletic programs, which would cost this money, and here's the impact that we discussed last year that would have in enrollment, for example. And so none of that has changed. We're in the same exact situation that Member Minnick just described. The question here is whether we are going to lean in and accept that these are data that have been reviewed, that we should rely on the expertise of our chief business officer in Ms. Ramos. And in that regard, just because Superintendent Gordon and his team are still on the line, can you just describe to our board and to our community whether there's, what is your role now that we've submitted, if you can just remind us of your role now that we've submitted our third interim, and that you continue to partner with us in reviewing the information as well.
Ms. Ramos?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was for
Ms. Sanchez.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, you okay? I wasn't sure if Dave was still on.
Yeah, I'm still on. Well, our role really hasn't changed at all. Our role is to try to help you move toward what's been mentioned, which is a solution to get out of this hole. And I think one of the things that, to be honest, is impeding you is I think to have a collaborative relationship with your labor partners. You have to be on the same page for what you're trying to strive for. And I think if what you're trying to strive for is stability in your budget, and you've spoken of that in many different ways tonight, a healthy reserve, a system by which you're eliminating deficit spending, a system in which you're able to plan from year to year rather than lurching from interim report to the end of the year. And I think if you're not on the same page in what you're seeking and what you're striving for, that's a problem that you're going to have to recognize and deal with, because I think at the top of the meeting, the public comments that were read were going back in time and recounting situations which have long since been either corrected or resolved in some way. And where we sit now is you're in trouble. FCMAT has said you're in trouble. The state auditor has said you're in trouble. And we could pluck little quotations out of any of their writings or spoken words and say, well, there really isn't a problem, but there is a problem. And I think unless and until everybody who's involved and responsible for doing what President Ryan and Superintendent Aguilar just talked about, delivering a full service, a full suite of high quality services to every child in the district, it's going to continue to be a struggle, because that will take a healthy organization where all of the leaders in the organization are on the same page with what they're doing and how they perceive the way the budget should help or hinder reaching that goal. So we're here to stay alongside you and keep helping you verify the numbers and see what your options are. But again, I I think it's the collective will of everybody involved in the organization that's going to make it happen.
Thank you, Superintendent Gordon. Looks like we are at the end of our comments and questions on this item. This was an information-only item. Obviously, this will be the source of much of our discussion in the coming weeks and months, and we will do everything in our power to make sure that we're keeping our public informed. We're in the process of trying to put in place a couple different formats of town halls to do a deeper dive into the budget decisions that we have before us, and we'll let you know once those details are solidified.